After pulling an all-nighter compiling a massive data report, a ruthless modern analyst falls asleep and wakes up transmigrated into a famously tragic ancient Chinese historical romance novel. She hasn't possessed the beloved heroine. She is Lin Yao, the despised, politically arranged wife of the cold and terrifying General Wei Qin. According to the plot, she is supposed to spend her days weeping in the cold palace courtyard while scheming to win his affection. Instead, Yao takes one look at the estate's horrific supply chain logistics, treats her marriage as a terrible corporate merger, and sets out to optimize the household ledgers to secure a massive divorce settlement. Her absolute refusal to participate in courtyard drama, and her terrifying efficiency with an abacus, completely derails the plot. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets, and emotional twists. Let's begin. Transmigration is, from a purely statistical standpoint, a mathematical impossibility. I had spent the night at my ergonomic desk, aggressively tapping my pen at 3 a.m. while compiling a massive data report, only to fall asleep and wake up in a completely different reality. I was no longer an analyst. I found myself lying on a carved mahogany bed draped in layers of heavy, crimson silk. The air smelled sharply of sandalwood incense, and outside the lattice windows, a bamboo wind chime clinked softly. Before my analytical brain could fully process the fact that I had just transmigrated into the exact historical melodrama I had been roasting. A novel titled The General's Weeping Petal. The intricately carved wooden doors slid open. In strode General Wei Qin. He looked exactly as the text described. A man sculpted out of jade and ice, wearing dark silver-threaded martial robes. His jawline was sharp, and his dark eyes radiated absolute zero temperature. The wedding is complete, as the emperor commanded. Wei Qin said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. He tossed a bamboo scroll onto the low tea table. But do not mistake this for a real marriage, Lin Yao. I have no time for your political games, or your courtyard scheming. You will be relocated to the western courtyard. You will be provided with basic rations. Do not seek me out. According to the plot, I was supposed to fall to my knees, sobbing and begging for his affection. Instead, I analyzed the parameters of his decree. The western courtyard, I repeated, my voice perfectly steady. Just to clarify, General, I am being permanently relegated to a remote section of the estate with zero oversight regarding my daily activities. He frowned, clearly thrown by the lack of weeping. Yes, you are confined there. Excellent, I said smoothly, sliding out of the bed. I view this arrangement not as a marriage, but as a hostile corporate merger. As your legally wedded principal wife, the imperial tax code dictates I am entitled to a monthly stipend of at least 50 silver taels. I expect it to be delivered promptly. Furthermore, I will need an abacus, a premium inkstone, and complete access to the estate's logistical supply ledgers. He stared at me in bewilderment. I proposed my terms clearly. Give me a year to optimize this estate's catastrophic supply chain. Pay me a generous severance package, and I will vanish from your life forever. I assume we have a mutual understanding regarding an eventual contract dissolution. A divorce, he echoed, bewildered. But seeing the cold, unyielding business logic in my eyes, he nodded. The terms were set. Chapter 2. The western courtyard of the Wei estate was exactly what one would expect from a place colloquially known as the Cold Palace. When the heavily armored guards shoved the creaking, rotting wooden doors open, a cloud of dust plumed into the air. The courtyard was a masterclass in structural neglect. Weeds choked the stone pathways, paper screens were torn, and a single, dramatically drooping willow tree sat in the center of the overgrown garden. Lounging on the dusty wooden steps were two servants, a maid named Chui and a young eunuch named Bao. They were cracking roasted sunflower seeds and spitting the shells directly onto the walkway. Greetings, madam, Chui said with bored insolence, instructing me to begin my weeping. According to the web novel, the original Lin Yao spent her first week in this courtyard kneeling in the dirt, weeping until her eyes bled, and refusing to eat anything except plain white rice. Her dramatic suffering was supposed to make General Wei Qin feel a twinge of guilt. Spoiler, it didn't. He just thought she was annoying. I, however, had spent the last 5 years of my life turning around failing tech startups. I didn't see a tragic prison. I saw a distressed asset with excellent privacy, zero managerial oversight, and massive potential for a hostile glow-up. I stopped at the base of the steps and looked at them with the exact deadpan, soul-crushing stare I used on junior analysts who messed up their pivot tables. "Stand up," I commanded. They blinked. Bao stopped chewing his sunflower seed. The absolute lack of tears on my face was clearly throwing a wrench into their afternoon schedule. Slowly, almost reluctantly, they stood up, dusting off their coarse robes. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, stepping up onto the porch so I was at eye level with them. "This courtyard is no longer a dumping ground for the general's unwanted baggage. It is now my corporate headquarters. And as of this exact second, you two are on a highly unpaid performance improvement plan." Cui exchanged a bewildered look with Bao. "A performance what? You have exactly 1 hour to execute a full sweep of this primary structure," I ordered, ignoring her question. "I want the cobwebs removed, the floors swept, and those torn paper screens replaced. Bao, you are on landscaping duty. Rip out every weed within a 10-yard radius of that depressing willow tree. If I see a single sunflower seed shell on this walkway when I return, I will personally sell you both to the copper mines to recoup my administrative costs. Are we understood?" Bao swallowed hard, suddenly looking very pale. The rumors of Lin Yao being a weak, pathetic flower were instantly evaporating before their eyes. "Aegis, Muthim." "Excellent. Now where is the main supply depot?" I asked, smoothing the front of my embroidered robes. "I need to requisition some office supplies." I ordered them to execute a full sweep of the primary structure, replacing torn screens and ripping out weeds. I threatened to sell them to the copper mines to recoup administrative costs if I saw a single sunflower seed shell upon my return. They instantly paled and set to work. Next, I marched to the estate's primary logistics pavilion to secure infrastructure. I confronted the head steward, Master Wang, bypassing his guards entirely. The head steward, an older, balding man, Master Wang, nearly dropped his ink brush when I marched right past his guards and slammed my hands down on his accounting desk. "Madam Lin," Master Wang gasped, scrambling to his feet and bowing awkwardly. You are not supposed to leave the western courtyard. The general's orders." "The general ordered me confined to the courtyard for residential purposes, Wang. He did not revoke my requisition clearance as the legal matriarch of this estate," I interrupted smoothly. "I need a solid oak desk, 3 premium Anhui inkstones, 50 sheets of high-grade rice paper and a suan pan," I demanded. When Wang questioned my need for an abacus, I threatened an imperial audit of his discretionary spending and his dusty bamboo scrolls. He immediately surrendered the supplies. Master Wang blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process the request. "A suan pan? An abacus? Madam, what use do you have for an abacus? Are you planning to count your tears?" I leaned across the wooden desk, my eyes locking onto his. "Wang, if you don't have an abacus delivered to my courtyard by sundown, I will start counting the discrepancies in your grain ledgers. And based on the sheer volume of dust on those bamboo scrolls behind you, I am guessing I'll find a lot of them." Master Wang turned the color of old parchment. "A desk and an abacus right away, madam," he squeaked. "And a pot of your strongest green tea," I added cheerfully, turning on my heel to walk back to my newly acquired fixer-upper. I have a very long night of restructuring ahead of me. By midnight, my office was operational. I had Wang deliver the household records for the last 3 fiscal quarters. Ancient Chinese accounting was a single-entry logistical nightmare, with no standardization of units. I spent the next 6 hours drawing grids across the rice paper, introducing double-entry bookkeeping to the Wei dynasty. The estate was hemorrhaging silver, but I now had the data to execute a massive turnaround. Chapter 3. By midnight, the western courtyard had been entirely transformed. The cobwebs were gone, the floors were swept clean enough to eat off, and the paper screens were pristine. Cui and Bao were currently huddled in the corner of the porch, looking at me with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep, primal fear. I was sitting cross-legged at my newly acquired solid oak desk, illuminated by 3 oil lamps. In front of me was a stack of blank rice paper, a freshly ground Anhui inkstone, and a beautifully crafted rosewood abacus. But I had a problem. I had no data. If I was going to secure a massive divorce settlement to fund my early retirement, I needed to know exactly how much liquid capital this estate possessed, which meant I needed the ledgers. I looked up at the trembling eunuch. "Bao." He flinched, nearly dropping his broom. "Aegis, Madame Zhao." Go to the main logistics pavilion. Tell Master Wang that I require the estate's financial records for the last 3 fiscal quarters. Specifically the military grain expenditures, the internal silk budgets, and the tax remittances. If he refuses, tell him I am legally authorized to request an imperial audit of his discretionary spending. Bao swallowed hard, bowed, and sprinted off into the dark. 20 minutes later, a highly panicked Master Wang arrived at my courtyard, trailing 2 massive wooden carts overflowing with heavy, dusty bamboo scrolls. "Madam," Master Wang wheezed, wiping sweat from his balding forehead. "These are the principal household records. But they are incredibly complex. It takes my team of 5 scholars a full month to balance the seasonal grain tax alone. You cannot possibly expect to." "Leave the carts, Wang," I interrupted, unrolling my first sheet of rice paper. I picked up my calligraphy brush, holding it not like a delicate artist, but like a weapon. "And tell your scholars they are vastly overpaid." Wang opened his mouth to argue, saw the absolute, terrifying focus in my eyes, and wisely decided to retreat. Once I was alone, I pulled the first bamboo scroll from the cart. I untied the leather binding and rolled it open across the desk. Ancient Chinese accounting was, to put it mildly, a logistical nightmare. It was a single entry system, written vertically with absolutely no standardization of units. There was no distinction between capital expenditures and operational costs. It was just a massive running list of things the estate bought and sold. Barbaric. I whispered in horror. I dipped my brush into the ink and quickly drew a massive grid across my rice paper. Asset. Liability. Equity. Revenue. Expense. I was about to introduce double-entry bookkeeping to the Wei dynasty. For the next 6 hours, the only sound in the western courtyard was the frantic, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of my rosewood abacus beads and the scratching of my brush. I drank 4 pots of highly caffeinated green tea. I didn't cry over my loveless marriage. I didn't look out at the moon and pine for the general. I audited the hell out of his estate. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and gold, I finally set my brush down. My hands were covered in black ink, and my neck was stiff, but my spreadsheet was complete. I stared at the numbers, letting out a long, slow exhale. General Wei Chen was a military genius. He had conquered 3 northern territories and secured the emperor's borders. He was also, financially speaking, an absolute idiot. The estate was hemorrhaging silver at a catastrophic rate. Based on my calculations, they were purchasing military grain rations from a merchant guild down south at premium retail prices, rather than negotiating a wholesale contract. Worse, they were shipping that grain through the imperial canal system, and paying a ridiculous 30% toll fee at every single checkpoint, completely ignoring a free, untold overland route that would only add 2 days to the supply chain. On top of that, the internal household budget was a disaster. The estate was spending thousands of taels a month importing rare southern silks for the concubines and female relatives, while simultaneously throwing away perfectly good, slightly out-of-season fabrics instead of recycling them, or selling them back to the merchant class at a discount. If this burn rate continued, the mighty Wei military estate would be completely insolvent in less than 18 months. And if the estate went broke, there would be no money for my severance package. Absolutely unacceptable, I muttered, aggressively circling a massive deficit in red ink. I couldn't just sit in the cold palace and wait for a divorce. I had to step in. I had to restructure this entire compound, save the general from his own horrific supply chain management, and demand a 20% cut of the gross savings as my exit fee. I rolled up my spreadsheet, tied it with a silk ribbon, and stood up, my joints popping. "Oi!" I barked. The maid, who had fallen asleep sitting up against a pillar, jolted awake. "Madam, draw a bath, fetch my most intimidating set of robes, and tell the kitchen I require a high-protein breakfast," I ordered, picking up my abacus and tucking it securely under my arm. "Then, find out where the general is holding his morning briefings. I have a budget proposal to submit." General Wei Chen sat at the head of a massive, carved obsidian war table in the command pavilion, surrounded by topographical maps and 3 military lieutenants. He was receiving a highly confusing report from his shadow guard, Mo, detailing my lack of weeping and violent clicking of an abacus. Before they could fully process the intelligence, I shoved the heavy wooden doors open. I was wearing a tailored dark plum martial robe with silver embroidery, the ancient equivalent of a ruthless power suit. my hair secured by a single jade pin, and an abacus tucked firmly under my arm. Lin Yao, Wei Chen warned, hand resting on his sword. You are strictly forbidden from entering the command pavilion. Unfortunately, your logistics department is a catastrophic failure, and I refuse to let my future severance package go bankrupt, I replied, slapping my rolled-up spreadsheet directly on top of his border maps. Your severance what? Wei Chen asked, completely derailed by the vocabulary. Your money, General. You are bleeding silver, I clarified. I unrolled the rice paper, pinning it down with wooden troop markers, and exposed his financial incompetence. The 3 lieutenants leaned in, expecting to see a hastily scribbled, tear-stained poem begging for his affection. Instead, they saw a flawlessly executed double-entry accounting grid. Look at this, I ordered, pointing my calligraphy brush at the red ink. You are purchasing military grain from the Azure Dragon Merchant Guild, shipping it up the Grand Canal, and paying a 30% imperial toll fee at 4 separate checkpoints. He argued the canal was the safest route. The canal is a tourist trap, I corrected sharply. If you pivot the shipments to the overland route through the Hushi corridor, you avoid the imperial tolls entirely. By switching to the overland route, you will reduce your quartermaster deficit by 42%. If you pivot the shipments to the overland route through the Hushi corridor, you avoid the imperial tolls entirely. Yes, you have to pay a hazard fee to the mercenary escorts, but that cost is static. The toll fees compound based on weight. By switching to the overland route, you will reduce your quartermaster deficit by 42%. The pavilion went completely silent. One of the lieutenants, the quartermaster, actually did the mental math in his head. His eyes widened in sheer horror as he realized the woman in the plum robes was entirely correct. You are freezing, my concubine's stipends, Wei Chen repeated. He didn't sound angry. He sounded entirely mesmerized. It's basic overhead reduction, I said dismissively. I tapped the abacus under my arm. Now here is my proposal. I will restructure your entire supply chain. I will balance these ledgers, eliminate the corruption in your staff, and turn this estate into a highly profitable enterprise. And in return? Wei Chen asked, leaning forward over the table, entirely invading my personal space. His dark eyes were locked onto mine. He was waiting for the catch. He was waiting for me to ask for his love, or his time, or a place in his bed. In return, I stated, completely unfazed by his intimidating proximity, I want 20% of the gross savings I generate, paid in solid silver taels, which I will take with me when we mutually dissolve this marriage contract next spring. Wei Chen froze. Dissolve the contract, he asked. Divorce, General. I stated brightly. You get a fully funded army and a clean ledger. I get early retirement. It's a win-win corporate merger. Leaving the stunned military men behind, I marched back to my headquarters to begin the restructuring. Chapter 4. Within 2 weeks, the Western Courtyard went from being a dilapidated prison to the most terrifyingly efficient administrative hub in the entire Wei estate. I had essentially turned the terrified Master Wang and his 5 scholars into my junior accounting interns. Every morning at dawn, they delivered the daily expenditure reports to my porch. If there was a single calculation error, I handed the scroll back with a red circle and a deeply disappointed sigh that made grown men tremble. Bao the eunuch had been promoted to my executive assistant, managing my calendar and brewing my highly caffeinated tea. Cui, the maid, was now my head of physical security, aggressively guarding the courtyard doors from nosy concubines whose stipends I had unceremoniously frozen. I was sitting at my oak desk, reviewing the updated grain ledgers, when the tranquility of my corporate sanctuary was shattered. From the main compound, the deep, resonant boom of the estate's war drum echoed through the air. It was the signal for a level 1 military emergency. Bow, I said, not looking up from my abacus. Go find out why the general is making that horrific noise. It's disrupting my workflow. Bao sprinted out the gates and returned 10 minutes later, completely out of breath and pale as a ghost. Madam Yao, he gasped, leaning heavily against the porch pillar. It's a disaster. A severe drought has struck the Central Plains. The Imperial Ministry of Revenue just issued an emergency decree embargoing all grain shipments to the Northern Territories. They claim the capital needs the reserves, but the Minister of Revenue is a political rival of the general, and he is using a natural disaster to intentionally starve Wei Chen's army and weaken his power base. I finished smoothly, connecting the political dots. A classic, albeit highly unethical, monopoly tactic. The general is furious, Bao whimpered. He has ordered his elite cavalry to saddle up. He is putting on his heavy armor. He plans to ride to the capital and hold the Minister of Revenue at sword point until the embargo is lifted. I pinched the bridge of my nose, letting out a heavy sigh. Men. So dramatic. So entirely lacking in strategic foresight. Chui, get my cloak. I have to go stop a PR nightmare. I marched across the estate, the heavy plum silk of my robe sweeping across the stone paths, and pushed open the doors to the main courtyard. It was absolute chaos. Soldiers were saddling war horses, armor was clanking, and in the center of it all stood General Wei Chun. He was clad in terrifying, dark iron scale armor, his black cloak billowing in the wind. He looked like the god of war himself, practically radiating a murderous, icy fury. He gripped the hilt of his broadsword, turning to mount his massive black warhorse. General! I called out, my voice easily cutting through the chaos. Wei Chun froze. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto me. The murderous fury in his expression faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by that familiar, intense fascination. Lin Yao, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Go back to your courtyard. This is a military crisis. The capital has cut our supply lines. I am aware, I said, walking right past his heavily armed guards and stopping directly in front of his warhorse. Put the sword away, General. Murdering the Minister of Revenue is a severe breach of imperial law, and the resulting treason trial will absolutely tank our quarterly margins. My men will starve in a month, Wei Chun snarled, leaning down toward me. The sheer physical intimidation of the man was staggering, but I had successfully negotiated severance packages with Wall Street billionaires. A man in ancient iron armor wasn't going to make me blink. No, they won't, I said calmly, pulling a neatly tied bamboo scroll from my sleeve and holding it up to him. Because relying on a single, politically compromised supplier for your most critical asset is amateur hour. Anticipating political bottlenecks is basic supply chain risk management. Wei Chun frowned, staring at the scroll. He didn't take it. What is that? It is a portfolio of forward contracts, I explained. Seeing his blank expression, I translated it into ancient terms. 2 weeks ago, when I audited your ledgers, I noticed the imperial grain supply was entirely dependent on the Minister of Revenue's goodwill. That is a single point of failure. So, I took the silver I saved by cutting your concubine's silk budgets and freezing the estate's luxury expenditures, and I quietly sent merchants to the independent farmers in the southern Jiangnan water towns. The entire courtyard went dead silent. The soldiers had stopped saddling their horses. I bought their autumn harvest in advance, at a fixed pre-drought wholesale price. I continued, tapping the scroll against my palm. And because I already rerouted your logistics to the overland Hushi corridor to avoid the canal tolls, the grain is currently moving via private mercenary caravans, entirely bypassing the imperial embargo. Your army will have a 6-month surplus arriving at the northern border in exactly 4 days. Wei Chun stared at me. He looked at his broadsword. He looked at his warhorse. Then he looked down at the woman who had just outmaneuvered the entire imperial court using nothing but a budget surplus and an abacus. You bought grain that hasn't been harvested yet? Wei Chun breathed, his icy composure completely shattering into pure, unadulterated awe. Before the drought even happened? It's called hedging your bets, General. Buy low, sell high, and never trust a government monopoly, I said, finally shoving the scroll into his armored chest. He caught it instinctively. Now please tell your men to stand down. The noise is giving me a migraine, and I need to get back to the western courtyard. I'm currently calculating the depreciation of your armory. I turned on my heel to leave, but before I could take a step, a heavy, gauntlet hand gently but firmly caught my wrist. I looked back. Wei Chun had dismounted his horse. He was standing entirely too close, towering over me, his dark eyes burning with an intensity. The 20%, Wei Chun said, his voice dropping an octave. Excuse me? I asked, my heart doing a highly illogical flutter against my ribs. The contract you proposed 2 weeks ago, the terrifying general murmured, his thumb lightly brushing the inside of my wrist. I will sign it. 20% of all savings. Whatever you need, Lin Yao. The estate is yours to command. I offered him a sharp, victorious smile, gently pulling my wrist from his grasp. I'll have Bao bring the paperwork to your study by sundown, General. Pleasure doing business with you. Chapter 5. At sundown, I entered General Wei Chen's private study, accompanied by Bao, who carried the freshly inked bamboo scrolls. The study was an intimidating fortress of dark mahogany and mounted weapons. Wei Chen sat behind his massive desk in a relaxed dark silk robe. The contracts, General, I announced, tapping the scrolls. Drafted in triplicate. Instead of reviewing the documents, he pulled out a beautifully carved, lacquered wooden box and opened it. Inside rested a small fortune in jewelry, pure spun gold hairpins, massive teardrop emerald earrings, and a translucent jade bangle. He offered them to me as a reward for saving his army, suggesting I shouldn't have to concern myself with silver and merchant trades. My accountant brain immediately engaged. These were highly illiquid assets with terrible resale value on the secondary market due to custom imperial engravings, guaranteeing at least a 40% depreciation the moment I left the compound. I gently closed the lid. I appreciate the gesture, General, but jewelry is a depreciating asset. I can't use gold hairpins to buy a shipping fleet, and I can't pay mercenary guards with emerald earrings. I need liquid capital. I need silver. I unrolled the contract, pointing out the specific clauses. Clause 1 secured my 20% performance bonus, paid into an untraceable account. Clause 2 granted me managerial autonomy, including the legal right to fire Master Wang out of a catapult if necessary. Finally, I presented Clause 4, the golden parachute, or mutual dissolution of marriage. Once my 20% cut reaches 100,000 silver taels, this contract triggers automatically. You sign the divorce paper, I take my silver, and I relocate to the Jiangnan provinces to start a silk monopoly. Wei Chen's amusement vanished. The temperature in the room dropped completely. He slowly stood up, wrapping his large hand completely over mine, and guided my ink brush to the bamboo scroll. He signed the document with an aggressive flourish, securing our professional boundaries and officially sealing my exit strategy. Chapter 6. The imperial palace in the capital was a logistical nightmare masquerading as a display of divine prosperity. Entering the grand hall of supreme harmony with Wei Chen, I noted the exorbitant overhead costs. Silk lanterns burning premium whale oil, and ridiculous volumes of exotic peacock feathers. I estimated the burn rate was astronomical. During the banquet, the tension peaked when Lord Shen, the Minister of Revenue, stood up. Still furious that I had bypassed his grain embargo, he attempted a public character assassination. He claimed I lacked the intellect for imperial verse and challenged me to compose a poem on the empire's grand prosperity. Wei Chen tried to intervene, but I smoothly slipped my hand from his grasp. Stand down, General, I whispered. I'm about to handle his tax returns. I stood, adjusting my sweeping black silk sleeves, and offered the emperor a mathematically precise bow. I am a practical woman, not a poet, I announced. However, I can absolutely speak to the empire's grand prosperity. Let us compose a verse regarding the autumn tax yield from the Jiangnan provinces. I recited the data loudly. According to Lord Shen's decree, the region suffered a 20% decrease due to the drought, resulting in a reported 800,000 silver taels. However, I pointed out that my private merchants reported a record surplus, and public canal lockkeeper ledgers showed 4,000 merchant barges passing through southern checkpoints. Applying the standard imperial tariff, I executed the mental math flawlessly. The actual revenue was closer to 1.4 million silver taels, which leaves a discrepancy of 600,000 silver taels, I concluded, locking eyes with the sweating minister. A very poetic sum, Lord Shen. I wonder, does it rhyme with the 3 new private estates you recently purchased in the capital? The emperor's eyes narrowed dangerously, and he ordered the screaming minister dragged off to the Ministry of Justice for an immediate audit. I calmly sat back down on my cushion. Your Majesty, give me 3 junior accountants and access to his ministry's archives. I only charge a 5% finder's fee. Wei Chen, thoroughly impressed by his CFO, quietly refilled my wine cup. Chapter 7. The aftermath of the imperial banquet yielded a highly lucrative return on investment. True to my word, I spent exactly 4 hours in the Ministry of Revenue's archives, shredded their fraudulent ledgers with red ink, and located the missing 600,000 silver taels. The emperor promptly delivered my 5% finder's fee, 30,000 taels of pure silver, directly to the western courtyard. I meticulously audited the delivery, sliding the heavy silver ingots into a reinforced iron lockbox. As I secured the brass padlock, General Wei Chen arrived for what was becoming an unprecedented series of morning intrusions. He strode into my office wearing deep sapphire robes trimmed with silver, carrying a polished wooden box. "If it is another box of depreciating gold hairpins, I am going to charge you an appraisal fee," I warned. He opened the box to reveal a massive, flawlessly carved Duan inkstone and 4 premium wolf hair calligraphy brushes. My accountant brain instantly calculated its astronomical market value. It was a highly practical capital expenditure that would prevent uneven ink grinding during aggressive accounting sessions. "This is highly efficient," I noted, genuinely pleased by the logistical upgrade. Wei Chen pulled up a chair and sat directly across from me. When I resumed my depreciation analysis on the cavalry saddles, he observed my ledger technique closely. He noted that I categorized expenditures differently than the Ministry of Revenue, separating structural assets from daily rations. "Because grouping them together is a catastrophic analytical failure," I explained briskly. "A warhorse is a depreciating asset. A sack of rice is a consumable expense. If you put them in the same column, you artificially inflate your net worth." I demonstrated the T account structure on the rice paper. Credits on the right, debits on the left. He observed the workflow with pure professional fascination. There was no emotional vulnerability shared between us. It was simply a highly optimized transfer of institutional knowledge between a CEO and a CFO. He left shortly after, promising to return to audit the armory budgets. Chapter 8. With my severance fund growing healthily, I recognized that uninvested cash is cash wasted to inflation. Diversification was required. I established the Golden Abacus Trading Company, using my own funds as startup capital to enter the high-yield northern silk trade. Sitting in my heated courtyard, I tracked the commodities index. Bao reported that our shipment of winter weight silk, which commanded a 300% markup from northern nomadic tribes, was fully loaded onto the wagons. Wei Chen abruptly entered the courtyard in his winter martial gear and dropped a redacted shipping manifest on my desk. As the military governor, he had intercepted my permits. "You are running a shadow corporation out of my cold palace," he stated. "It is a fully independent limited liability company," I corrected. "It has absolutely zero impact on the estate's operational budget." Wei Chen analyzed my business plan. He acknowledged the target market was sound, but identified a critical vulnerability in my physical security. I had hired the Iron Shield Mercenary Guild, which he pointed out would easily rout upon encountering the Black Wind bandits in the snowline, resulting in 100% inventory shrinkage. The risk of total asset liquidation was catastrophic to my Q4 projections. Hiring a private militia would completely destroy my overhead costs. Recognizing an opportunity for a strategic partnership, Wei Chen offered a solution. His elite shadow cavalry required live target training exercises during the winter. Escorting a high-value silk caravan through bandit territory provided the perfect training scenario. "You want to use the Imperial Army to escort my private silk monopoly?" I asked. "I want to protect my co-chief executive officer's investments," he replied, utilizing my corporate terminology. In exchange for this military-grade security contract, his consulting fee was strictly time-based. A working dinner every evening in the Western Courtyard to assist with auditing the provincial tax returns. I accepted the contract. It was a perfectly balanced B2B negotiation. Chapter 9. The optimized operational flow of our evening auditing sessions was abruptly interrupted by a severe human resources crisis. Bao burst into the courtyard to announce the arrival of Lady Rulon, the general's distant cousin, who had come to offer herself as a secondary wife and warm the general's bed. Rulon entered my office draped in pale pink silk, attempting to project fragile beauty. She mockingly offered to take over the management of the inner courtyard. Instead of throwing a jealous tantrum, I immediately identified her as a source of unpaid labor. "Your timing is absolutely impeccable," I said brightly. "We are severely understaffed in the mid-level management sector." I grabbed a 30-pound stack of bamboo scrolls from the pending pile and dumped it directly into her arms. "Welcome to the logistics department," I announced. "I am delegating the Western livestock depreciation ledgers to you." I instructed her to calculate the feed-to-weight ratio for 3,000 cavalry horses and cross-reference it against winter oat prices. If we define depreciation using the straight line method, she would need to calculate the precise useful lifespan of every asset. Rulon shrieked, dropping her demure act and protesting that she was a noblewoman meant to compose poetry. I handed her a spare abacus and threatened a performance improvement plan if she didn't balance the debits and credits by sundown. Wei Chen appeared at the courtyard entrance, arms crossed over his armored chest, having witnessed the exchange. Rulon dropped the ledgers onto the floor and fell to her knees, sobbing for protection against my cruelty. Wei Chen coldly analyzed the situation. She dropped the livestock ledgers, he noted. That is a severe violation of estate protocol. Should we fire her? Instantly, I agreed. Her KPI metrics are abysmal. Without hesitation, Wei Chen fired his cousin, ordering her to return to the capital immediately or face an audit of her family's estate. The HR issue was resolved with maximum efficiency. Chapter 10. By the middle of the winter solstice, a brutal blizzard had buried the western courtyard under 2 feet of snow. Inside my heated office, I sat hunched over the massive oak desk, staring at a topographical map of the Chilean mountains. I was charting a secondary, covert supply route for heavy siege ballistas required by the Northern Vanguard. General Wei Chen sat beside me. He had discarded his heavy outer furs and wore only a dark, close-fitting silk inner robe. We had established a highly productive routine, but the proximity in the confined space required strict adherence to professional boundaries. Your breathing is currently disrupting my logistical calculations, I stated crisply, keeping my eyes fixed on the map. He did not apologize. Instead, he observed the tiny smear of black ink my brush had accidentally left on the mountain range. He noted my erratic pulse. If my pulse is erratic, it is due to the sheer stress of trying to route 2-ton siege weapons through a blizzard without alerting the northern spies. I clarified, establishing the operational reality. Not because my co-CEO refuses to respect workplace boundaries. Wei Chen nodded, his expression entirely serious. He understood the gravity of the supply chain logistics. We spent the next 3 hours mapping elevation changes against the tensile strength of the transport wagons. We applied complex physics calculations to ensure the ballistas wouldn't succumb to structural failure under the extreme cold. We utilized a fundamental mechanics formula to calculate the shear stress on the wagon axles. There was no romantic overture. There were no declarations of undying affection. There was only the intense, mutual respect of 2 high-level executives navigating a severe logistical crisis in a hostile climate. We successfully routed the weaponry, ensuring the Vanguard's operational readiness, and concluded the evening with a firm handshake to signify the completion of the project. Chapter 11. The arrival of spring brought the thawing of the northern mountain passes, a massive influx of Q1 revenue from my silk monopoly, and a warrant for my business partner's execution. I was sitting in the newly expanded, sunlit logistics pavilion when Bao sprinted into the room, tripping over the threshold. Treason! The Imperial Guard is here! Bao shrieked, waving a scroll stamped with the golden Imperial seal. They are demanding the general return to the capital to face the Emperor. I calmly finished tallying a column on my suanpan before looking up. Treason is a very strong accusation, Bao. It also carries a severe penalty regarding asset seizure. Who is the plaintiff? Bao practically tore his hair out, explaining that General Han, the weasel-faced commander of the Eastern Army, claimed Wei Chen had been embezzling imperial military funds for 2 years to secretly fund a private rebellion. General Han had even presented the emperor with confidential ledgers as proof. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face. Forging a military ledger to frame a political rival was standard historical drama. However, attempting to present fraudulent accounting to me, a woman who had personally audited every grain of rice in the estate down to the 5th decimal point, was absolute financial suicide. Bao informed me that Wei Chen was already in the courtyard with the Imperial Guards, stripped of his weapons but radiating an aura of terrifying, unbothered calm. Wei Chen had instructed Bao to tell me to stay behind and protect the assets while he handled it. Absolutely not. This is a hostile corporate sabotage, and I am the co-CEO, I declared, smoothing my dark plum silk robes. Kui. Bao. Hitch the heavy transport wagons. We are going to the capital, and we are bringing the filing cabinets. 3 hours later, the Grand Hall of Supreme Harmony was a powder keg of political tension. The emperor sat on his golden throne, looking grim. Standing in the center of the hall was Wei Chen, entirely unbothered, while General Han practically vibrated with smug victory across from him. These ledgers show that General Wei Chen diverted 300,000 silver taels from the winter supply budget to purchase illegal siege weaponry. General proclame dramatically. When the emperor asked Wei Chen to explain the expenditures, Wei Chen didn't even look at the throne. He looked toward the massive red doors. "I have nothing to say, Your Majesty," Wei Chen replied smoothly. "My chief financial officer handles all external audits." Right on cue, I kicked the heavy oak doors open. I strode into the grand hall, flanked by 4 Wei estate guards who were wheeling 2 massive, groaning wooden carts overflowing with neatly bound, color-coded bamboo scrolls. "Apologies for the delay, Your Majesty," I announced, my voice echoing off the gold leaf pillars. Traffic on the Grand Canal was abhorrent. "I hear we are discussing my husband's Q4 expenditures." General Han immediately protested that women were not permitted in an imperial tribunal. "I am the legally recognized matriarch of the Wei estate, and the primary executor of its supply chain, General Han. Please sit down before you embarrass yourself," I snapped, marching straight past him to stand beside Wei Chen. Wei Chen looked down at me with absolute, arrogant pride. "You brought the filing cabinets." "I brought the receipts," I murmured back. I approached General Han's table to examine his irrefutable ledgers. It took my modern accountant brain exactly 4 seconds to spot the glaring, structural flaws in the forged single-entry system. I let out a sharp, terrifying laugh. "General Han," I said, dropping the scroll in disgust. "A forged ledger is like a bat to pay. It only looks convincing if you don't examine the roots. This math is an insult to my profession." I pulled my sewing pan from my sleeve and slammed it onto the table. Han's forgery claimed Wei Chen diverted funds from the winter grain supply. My actual, double-entry audited records proved we didn't use imperial funds at all. We used a private budget to purchase grain at a fixed wholesale rate in Jiangnan before the drought even hit. General Han's forgery includes a line item for 3,000 bolts of winter canvas. I explained loudly, clicking the abacus beads. But he priced the canvas at the capital's retail rate of 5 taels a bolt. The Wei estate operates on a direct-to-manufacturer pipeline. We pay 2.5 taels a bolt. Whoever forged this ledger didn't have access to our wholesale discount codes. General Han began to sweat profusely, stammering that the silver was still missing from the treasury. "Oh, I know where the silver is," I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made several ministers step back. I walked to my second cart and pulled out a scroll tied with a red ribbon. I had run a cross-referencing analysis on the Eastern Army's supply routes during the carriage ride. The shipping manifests from the Iron Anvil Blacksmith Guild show that 300 heavy ballistas were delivered to the eastern border last month. I announced, holding the scroll up. "Paid for in imperial silver. Silver that perfectly matches the deficit in General Han's own Q1 budget." I turned slowly to face the trembling rival general. "You didn't frame my husband to cover up his treason, Han," I whispered deadly. "You framed him to cover a massive, sloppy margin call on your own embezzlement scheme. And you used terrible math to do it." The emperor's face turned a furious shade of red. "Guards, seize General Lin. Strip him of his rank and throw him in the imperial dungeon." As the screaming general was dragged out, I calmly turned to the terrified emperor. "Your Majesty," I said pleasantly, "since I just saved the Ministry of Justice a 6-month investigation, I will be forwarding my standard consulting invoice to the Imperial Treasury and a right to divorce. We also accept solid silver taels." Chapter 12. 3 weeks after successfully defending against General Han's corporate sabotage, the Wei estate was functioning at absolute peak efficiency. The northern silk routes were secured, the consulting fees had cleared, and my private ledger had finally achieved its ultimate objective. I sat across from General Wei Chen at the Obsidian War table in the command pavilion. I placed the original temporary restructuring and severance agreement on the table between us. "General," I said, adopting a tone of finality, "I ran the final Q2 numbers this morning. My 20% cut of the estate savings, combined with the silk monopoly revenue, has officially surpassed 100,000 silver taels." Wei Chen's expression remained perfectly stoic, an unreadable mask of military discipline. "According to Clause 4, the contract triggers," I continued smoothly, "you are required to sign a letter of repudiation, and I am contractually obligated to pack my jade and relocate to Jiangnan. He picked up the bamboo scroll. There was no emotional outburst. There was no desperate plea for me to stay. He recognized that a contract was a contract, and the parameters of our merger had reached their logical conclusion. Wei Chen produced the imperial jade seal, staining it with red cinnabar ink, and officially stamped the dissolution paperwork. The Q4 objectives have been met ahead of schedule, Wei Chen stated, his voice a low, steady rumble of pure professional respect. Your restructuring of the Northern Logistics Network was flawless. You have my gratitude, co-CEO. I packed my substantial liquid assets and relocated to the Jiangnan water towns. I did not pine for the cold palace, and Wei Chen did not abandon his post. Instead, we established a highly lucrative partnership. My newly minted silk monopoly supplied the Northern Vanguard, while his shadow cavalry provided subsidized freight security. We maintained separate headquarters, pristine ledgers, and a strictly professional correspondence that ensured mutual profitability for the rest of our lives. Epilogue. For years later, the Golden Abacus Trading Company was no longer just a regional startup. It was the most terrifyingly optimized, highly profitable economic powerhouse in the southern provinces. I was sitting in my heavily renovated, luxurious corporate headquarters in the Jiangnan water towns. I wore a sweeping robe of crimson silk, clicking my rosewood abacus with terrifying speed as I reviewed the annual tax returns. My severance package had provided the perfect seed capital, and my diversification into raw silk and maritime shipping had paid off exponentially. Bao, who had eagerly relocated with me as my chief of operations, hurried into the sunlit veranda and bowed deeply. Madam Yao, General Wei Chen has arrived for the biannual logistics summit, Bao announced, stepping aside. Wei Chen strode into the courtyard. He looked exactly as imposing and devastatingly professional as he had 4 years ago, clad in his signature dark, silver-threaded martial robes. He was accompanied not by an armed vanguard, but by 3 high-level quartermasters carrying heavily secured lockboxes of audited financial reports. How are the Q3 margins? The fearsome warlord asked casually, peering over my shoulder at the spreadsheet. And yes, in case you were wondering, I explained some modern terms to a few people like Q2 or Q3, B2B and some more. We are up 40% year over year, I replied, making a final notation and setting my premium wolf hairbrush down on my Duan inkstone. If we apply the compound annual growth rate to our joint freight operations over the past 4 years, the metrics are staggering. I quickly jotted down the formula for his quartermasters to review. Wei Chen reviewed the calculation, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute, unconditional reverence for the math. Flawless execution as always. Though it appears our success is causing bureaucratic friction in the capital, I received another letter from the Dowager Aunt this morning. I leaned back in my oak chair and crossed my arms. Let me guess. The aristocratic women are deeply concerned that you still refuse to take a principal wife, and they believe you need someone to manage your inner courtyard. Wei Chen snorted in absolute derision. Tell the Dowager Aunt that my estate is managed by a decentralized, outsourced financial genius who could bankrupt her entire lineage before breakfast, Wei Chen rumbled, adjusting his heavy sword belt. Furthermore, tell her that my current heir-to-asset ratio is flawless. I have instituted a merit-based succession plan among my top lieutenants. Adding a traditional wife to the hierarchy would unnecessarily dilute our resources. I burst out laughing. You've been studying the corporate glossary I wrote for you. I am a dedicated primary logistics contractor, Wei Chen murmured smoothly, his eyes shining with intense, strictly professional devotion. He rounded the desk, tapping his callous finger against a new stack of blank ledgers. Now leave the Q3 audits, madam. The Empire's supply chain can run itself for an hour. Your business partner requires your undivided attention to finalize the Q4 Northern Cavalry projections. I smiled, pulling out a fresh sheet of grid paper. I had woken up in this ancient, dramatic world expecting a tragedy. Instead, I had successfully executed a flawless exit strategy, secured an absolute monopoly, and found the most reliable B2B logistics partner in the hemisphere. The abacus was reset for the day. The assets of both the Wei military and the Golden Abacus Trading Company were perfectly secure. And frankly, business was booming. Special chapter. Before a company can truly pivot to a new venture, or in my case, before I could pack up my silver and fully embrace my independent, romance-free life as a wealthy CEO, The legacy liabilities must be cleared. As the winter solstice approached, I found myself experiencing a highly illogical workflow disruption. Occasionally, when looking out at the dramatic, snow-covered willow tree in the western courtyard, I would feel a phantom ache in my chest. It wasn't my pain. It was a residual emotional deficit left behind by the original Lin Yao. The tragic, sheltered girl who had spent her days weeping into silk handkerchiefs, utterly broken by a man who treated her like unwanted baggage. To move forward, I needed to reconcile this bad debt. The original Lin Yao deserved closure, and my analytical brain demanded a logical explanation for General Wei Chen's initial, catastrophic lack of basic human decency. During one of our highly productive evening sessions auditing the provincial tax returns, I set down my premium wolf hairbrush. Wei Chen was seated across from me, reviewing the cavalry depreciation ledgers. "General," I said, my tone shifting from crisp professionalism to genuine inquiry, "we need to discuss the initial parameters of our merger. Specifically, your onboarding strategy." Wei Chen didn't look up from his scroll, though his posture stiffened slightly. "My onboarding strategy? You walked into my room, tossed a bamboo scroll at me, and permanently relegated me to a rotting, unheated courtyard with zero oversight and basic rations," I stated flatly, referencing our very first interaction. From a management perspective, it was excessively hostile. "Why?" Wei Chen finally lowered the scroll. His dark, icy blue eyes met mine, devoid of their usual arrogant amusement. For the first time, he looked like a man navigating a minefield rather than a boardroom. "You were a political spy I had been forced to marry," Wei Chen said, his voice a low, serious rumble. "The marriage was commanded by the emperor. Do you understand what that meant for this estate?" I crossed my arms, waiting for the data. The emperor and the minister of revenue were actively trying to weaken my power base, Wei Chen explained, referencing the political rivals who would later attempt to starve his army. "They forced the daughter of a capital nobleman into my inner sanctuary. If I had welcomed you, my own lieutenants would have viewed me as compromised. If I had brought you into the main pavilion, you would have been exposed to highly classified military intelligence." He leaned forward, resting his callous hands on the oak desk. "More importantly," he continued, his tone turning grim, "if you had shown yourself to be a competent spy, my shadow guards would have quietly assassinated you within a week to protect the northern vanguard. By confining you to the western courtyard and publicly declaring my absolute disdain for you, I neutralized you as a political threat. I made you entirely irrelevant to the imperial court. I processed this information. So the cold palace banishment wasn't just cruelty, I reasoned. It was a quarantine protocol. You were isolating a perceived biological threat to your military infrastructure." "It was survival, Lin Yao," he corrected quietly. "The capital sent a fragile, weeping girl into a war zone. If I had played the role of the doting husband, the emperor would have used you as leverage to control my army. You would have been a hostage. By discarding you, I made you useless to them. It was a brutal calculation, but it kept my borders secure and, frankly, kept you alive." I sat back in my chair, the phantom ache in my chest slowly beginning to dissipate. The original novel had framed Wei Chen's behavior as the classic, icy jerkass trope, meant to be thawed by the heroine's endless, pathetic weeping. But looking at the stark, ruthless reality of ancient courtyard politics, the logic was airtight. This wasn't a romance novel. It was a hostile political merger forced upon both of us. Wei Chen wasn't a misunderstood romantic lead. He was a military commander tasked with keeping tens of thousands of men alive. He had treated the original Lin Yao not as a wife, but as a liability that needed to be managed. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, speaking internally to the lingering ghost of the original Lin Yao. "Your tears weren't wasted. They were just misallocated. You weren't a failure for not winning his heart. You were a civilian dropped into a high-stakes corporate espionage war. It wasn't your fault, and it wasn't a reflection of your worth. The game was rigged from the start." When I opened my eyes, the heavy, oppressive sadness that had occasionally haunted the corners of the western courtyard was entirely gone. The emotional books were finally balanced. A logically sound, if highly unethical, risk management strategy, I finally nodded, offering Wei Chen a crisp, understanding look. "Thank you for the transparency, General. It clears up a significant discrepancy in my historical data." Wei Chen exhaled a slow, quiet breath, as if a weight had been lifted from the obsidian war table. Are the ledgers reconciled, co-CEO? They are perfectly balanced, I confirmed, picking up my calligraphy brush once more. The ghost of the tragic heroine was laid to rest, freeing me to pack my solid silver tails and launch my independent, highly lucrative future in Jiangnan. Now let us return to the Q4 projections. We have an empire to run. That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.